This is Dark Stuff, the story of a young single mother, 31-year-old Linda Patterson Slatten, who was brutally raped and murdered on September 4th, 1981. Her life was taken in the dark, early morning hours in Lakeland, Florida, as she slept in her own bedroom, that seemingly most safe of places. There is a lifetime of pain that exists between that long ago night and the one that would come later, that would bring with it a name for that faceless darkness who stole into a little family's home and destroyed 3 lives, 1 with murder and 2 with the aftermath. The light in the midst of all this darkness is that justice comes for those that hurt others. Sometimes it takes decades. In Linda's case, it took 38 years, but come it did. Welcome to Bitter Endings, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, J.R. Erickson. In Bitter Endings, I'll bring you stories of those taken too soon, the silent many who no longer have a voice through which to seek justice. The Bitter Endings podcast is sponsored by my fiction novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that braid elements of haunting and murder mystery, and they're all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com. in audio format if you are an Audible listener, as well as in ebook and paperback. Before we dive all the way into today's episode, I just want to apologize for being a week late on the podcast. My intention when I started Bitter Endings was to release every other week on Wednesday. And as I've mentioned in other podcasts, I am a fiction author. I have a book series called the Northern Michigan Asylum series, and I am currently in the launch period of the latest book, which is Let Her Rest. And every 3 months I release a book, and there always comes this high pressure point when I'm trying to get the book proofed into the editors, and everything else sort of slips to the wayside and I turn into a grumpy beast. So that is why I was unable to release a podcast last week. And there were other things that came up. I lost 15 minutes of the podcast I'd recorded, and I was out of town. There were just things. So I do apologize for that. My goal going forward is to release every 2 weeks. "31-year-old Linda Patterson Slatten was starting over. She'd recently moved with her 2 sons to apartment number 31 at the Bonnet Shores Apartments located at 303 North Bruno Parkway in Lakeland, Florida. The Bonnet Shores apartment complex was a newer series of apartments that was only partially occupied when Linda and her sons moved in just weeks before her murder. The apartments were newly built, federally subsidized housing. Linda had been married and divorced, and though life wasn't perfect for the single mom, her focus was always on her 2 sons, Tim, who was 12, and Jeff, who was 15. Linda was a mother who showed up for her kids. They went on adventures to parks and beaches. She even took them to see Van Halen and Kiss in concert. As a single mom, she often struggled financially, but her sons insisted she always provided a good life for them. She sewed her own clothes and taught Tim to sew as well so he could pass home economics in school. She was petite, standing just over 5 feet tall and weighing around 100 pounds. Her hair was a coppery brown and cut above her shoulders. She'd previously been a cashier at the Piggly Wiggly grocery store, but at the time of her death, she wasn't working. Linda was born and raised in Alabama, where she married and divorced the father of her 2 sons. She was a kind and trusting woman who made friends with anyone and everyone she encountered, including picking up hitchhikers. At the time of her murder, she was dating a man who worked in construction. They'd hit it off after she'd started chatting with him one day while he was out working on a road project. Her sons would later wonder if her unsuspecting nature might have played a role in her murder. Let's go back there now, to a balmy Florida evening, nearly 40 years gone by. Temperatures were hovering around 80 degrees. In the complex of apartments where Linda and her 2 sons were starting their new life. A new life that was close to family, as Linda's sister lived in one of the apartments and her parents resided in Lakeland. The series of apartments were a social space, and on Thursday, September 3rd, 1981, Linda and her 12-year-old son Tim, who'd been dropped off earlier that evening by his assistant football coach, Joseph Mills, wandered back and forth between a neighbor's apartment. They drank iced tea and played cards. Linda's older son Jeff had come home from football practice after school, arriving around 5:30. He was hungry, but didn't find much food in the apartment, so he rode his bike to his grandparents' house. At 9:30 p.m., they drove him home, but his mom and Tim weren't there since they were visiting with Linda's friend in another apartment. Around 10, Linda stopped home to let Jeff know that she and Tim were playing cards nearby. At 11:30 p.m., Linda walked Tim back to their apartment to put him to bed. She washed dishes, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed herself. Jeff, who'd been watching television, turned off the TV and went to bed just after midnight. He would be the last known person to see Linda alive. So here we are in a little apartment with a mother and her 2 sons having an ordinary night like they'd done so many times before. As I mentioned previously, it was hot in Florida that September evening, and the apartments didn't have air conditioning, so Linda slept with her window open. The ground floor apartment had 3 bedrooms, and after the boys went to bed that night, they wouldn't hear a thing until the following morning, when they were roused from sleep to discover their mother was gone forever. Sometime in the early morning hours of Friday, September 4th, 1981, a man removed the screen from Linda's first-floor window and crawled inside. It's unlikely that she woke up before the attack based on her sons never hearing a commotion and no evidence of a struggle at the scene. The man raped Linda and then strangled her with a wire coat hanger. Hours later, at 8:30 a.m., Linda's younger sister, Judy Butler, who resided in the same apartment complex, walked to Linda's apartment to see if her sister wanted to have coffee. Linda didn't answer the door, so Judy started home. However, as she left, she noticed the screen missing from her sister's bedroom window. When she went for a closer look, she made a grisly discovery. Her sister lay sprawled on the bed, dead, with a wire coat hanger wrapped around her neck. After hearing the screams of Linda's sister, maintenance man John Allen, who worked for the Lakeland Housing Authority, called police. Investigators descended on the apartment. Jeff and Tim were both sound asleep in their rooms. They were woken by police and rushed from the apartment. However, before Tim was escorted out, he glimpsed the horrifying scene in his mother's bedroom. Linda's dress was pulled down from the top and up from the bottom, leaving her mostly naked. Her shoes and underwear were located on the rug beneath her feet, and based on bleeding between her legs, it appeared she'd been sexually assaulted. Linda's body was transported to Lakeland General Hospital, and her autopsy was performed by Assistant Medical Examiner Dr. Ramsey, who concluded she'd been raped and strangled. Although investigators spoke with Linda's friends and family, questioned other residents in the apartment complex, and launched an in-depth investigation into Linda's murder, they were unable to find her killer. One positive that came out of the investigation was DNA evidence. They recovered semen at the scene and also a partial fingerprint. Unfortunately, it didn't match anyone in their criminal database. They were also able to rule out Linda's ex-husband and current boyfriend with the DNA. Life as Jeff and Tim knew it ended in the late dark of that early September morning of 1981. Their mother was gone. After they were rushed from the apartment that morning, they never returned. Instead, they moved in with their grandparents, their mother's parents, who lived in North Lakeland, and they were raised by them. However, life doesn't simply go on. The brothers lived with constant anger and fear. They both dropped out of high school before graduating and found themselves sort of aimless and forever haunted by their mother's unsolved murder. Over time, Linda's sons started to find their way. Tim became a welder mechanic while Jeff became a truck driver. Both men got married and had children in the same area in Florida they'd last lived with their mother. Though they continued to live their lives, they never gave up hope their mother's murder would be solved. Beginning in their 20s, the brothers started contacting the Lakeland Police Department, asking for developments on the case. They also reached out to the media, asking for stories covering Linda and her murder. In the early 2000s, a local Lakeland newspaper called The Ledger covered another cold case about a woman murdered in Lakeland in May of 1984. The brothers reached out to the newspaper and asked them to do a story on Linda. The Ledger's previous story had brought light to the unsolved murder of 79-year-old Ann Houston, a woman who baked cookies for neighborhood children and her church and was known locally as the Cookie Lady. She'd been found stabbed to death in her apartment. The article conjured new leads in the case, and Houston's murderer was found and later convicted in 2006. Linda's sons hoped a story about their mother's case might produce similar new leads and bring awareness to a murder that some had forgotten and others had never even heard of. They desperately wanted to find out who killed their mother. In a 2006 interview with The Ledger, Jeff Slaten said he sometimes tried to remember the sound of her voice, but he no longer could. He feared that he would take his last breath without ever knowing who killed her. In the 30-plus years that has passed since Linda's murder, more than 24 detectives have worked the case. They tracked leads in Florida and as far as Louisiana and North Carolina. Tim and Jeff stayed in regular contact with the Lakeland police and formed close bonds with several officers and detectives. Tim Slaten even named one of his own sons after a detective for how diligently he worked their mother's case. In many cases, this is where the story ends, but not for Linda Patterson Slatten. The Lakeland police formed a cold case homicide team in 2014. In 2017, a detective started focusing on Linda's murder. In 2018, Lori Napolitano at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement reached out to Detective Tammy Hathcock, who was investigating Linda's cold case. She asked her if she was interested in utilizing genetic genealogy in an attempt to locate Linda's killer. Enter PARABON NANO Labs Incorporated. Their company would be the game changer for Tim and Jeff Slaten. PARABON NANO Labs, a company located in Reston, Virginia, wasn't originally involved in the business of forensics. The company, which is a subsidiary of PARABON Computation, won a Small Business Innovation Research Program solicitation, that's a lot of words, to determine if genetics could be used to create a composite appearance of an individual. Eventually, PARABON created a program called their Snapshot tool, which creates a composite image of a person based on their genetic information. When the Golden State Killer was identified through genetic genealogy in California in 2018, PARABON saw an opportunity opening up in the area of forensics. They shifted their focus towards genetic genealogy to help solve cold cases. Genetic genealogy combines analysis of genes with other methods of genealogical research to uncover the family tree. I'm definitely not an expert on genetics, not even a novice. While researching this segment, I struggled to take all the information and paraphrase it into something that made sense to me and to you, which was not an easy task, and I'm not entirely sure how well I have done. But one of the real benefits to genetic genealogy is its reach. Where police have access to a database of criminals convicted of certain offenses, family tree geneticists potentially have access to the entire world. PARABON accessed a public DNA database known as GEDmatch that allows anyone to upload their DNA, whereas CODIS, the combined DNA index system the police use for matching DNA, consists of 20 genetic markers when matching samples against potential perpetrators. Family tree DNA tests consists of hundreds of thousands of markers. The reach is amplified when genetic genealogists start tracing the family tree, using public records and other sources to track down hundreds of family members from a single DNA profile. The detective working Linda's case submitted DNA from the murder scene to PARABON. Using GEDmatch, PARABON found multiple genetic hits for family members of the likely perpetrator of the crime. The family trees of those matches were then tracked to see who lived in or near Lakeland, Florida at the time of her murder and matched the likely characteristics of a person who may have committed the crime. They found a likely suspect and sent the information to Lakeland police. They advised the detectives to look closely at 58-year-old Joseph Mills, who had relatives who matched the DNA at the murder scene and who also lived near Linda when she was murdered. You might recognize the name Joseph Mills. He was the 20-year-old assistant football coach of Linda's youngest son, Tim Slaten. The night before Linda was murdered, Joseph, known to the kids he coached as Joe, drove Tim home from practice since Linda did not own a car. Joe simply dropped Tim off. He never spoke to Linda that night or any other as far as Tim remembered. Still, Lakeland police weren't ready to make an arrest. First, they had to obtain a sample of Joseph's DNA to compare against the DNA left on Linda's body. Lakeland police learned through Joseph's Facebook page that he had a colostomy bag. They then staked out his Florida home and collected his trash. They sent several items to the Lakeland Police Crime Lab, including 2 cotton swabs, 2 adhesive patches for colostomy bags, and a plastic spoon. On August 9, 2019, the lab confirmed that the DNA profile found on Linda Slaten's body matched Joseph Mills. Investigators also matched Joseph's fingerprints to prints recovered at the scene. He'd been previously fingerprinted when he was arrested for grand theft in 1984. However, his prints were never connected to those found at the Slaten home because the print at the murder scene was only partial. Detectives brought 58-year-old Mills, who was married with children and still living in the Lakeland area, in for questioning. Initially, he played clueless, acting as if he didn't even remember Linda's murder. In a second interview, he changed his tune, saying, "Oh yeah, he remembered she'd been murdered, but didn't know her personally and didn't know anything about the crime." In December of 2018, Joseph Mills was taken into custody and charged with perjury based on his previous claims he'd never been in Linda's apartment. After all, the police had both DNA and fingerprint evidence that he had been there. After he was read his Miranda rights, Joseph's story changed yet again. He now claimed that after he dropped Timothy off at home, Linda offered him to come back later for a, quote, good time. When he returned, Linda wanted to have wild sex, which involved twisting a wire hanger around her neck and tightening it during intercourse. She lost consciousness, and Joseph climbed out the window through which he'd entered Linda's bedroom. Joseph was arrested for Linda's murder. He was charged with murder, burglary, and sexual battery. At the time of Linda's murder, Joseph Clinton Mills had been only 20 years old. He worked at the Publix dairy warehouse and served as the assistant coach for the Lakeland Volunteers football program. Mills had picked up 12-year-old Tim for football practice and dropped him off at his apartment several times before Linda's death. He claimed to have only spoken to Linda once when she walked out to his car and thanked him for driving Tim home. Mills also claimed he'd never been in the Slatens' apartment. On December 19, 2018, the grand jury indicted Joseph Mills for Linda's murder. The Slaten brothers were shocked to learn that Mills had been arrested. In an emotional interview, Timothy Slaten said, quote, "This is somebody I trusted, and for him to do something like this to my family. I saw the crime scene when I was young. It's still fresh in my brain today. I saw it firsthand, and what he has done, he's a monster." In a press conference after the arrest, Jeff Slaten said the unsolved murder of his mother left him always scared to death that he was friends with the guy who'd killed her. Tim also added that he'd continued to get rides to football practice with Joseph Mills for months after Linda's death. He never had a clue he was riding with her killer. I did look for additional information about the upcoming trial for Joseph Mills or a plea deal, but I was unable to find any news reports at all after December of 2019. So I will update the podcast in the future when that information comes up. But as far as research into the case, this pretty much sums up the murder of Linda Slaten. Usually at the end of the podcast, I talk a little bit about my thoughts and theories surrounding the case. And obviously, since this is a likely solved case, which, I'm reluctant to say that only because Mills has not yet been convicted of the crime, but in all likelihood he will be. I will just talk a little bit about my thoughts around the murder of Linda Slaten. So the first thing, I did not find Mills' story of consensual sex even remotely believable. First off, Linda was dating someone at the time of her murder. Second, if she'd offered the man to come back, I'm pretty sure she would have let him in the front door rather than expecting him to crawl through a window. Third, wild sex is one thing, but a wire coat hanger wrapped around someone's neck is sadistic, and I find it hard to believe that anyone is going to do something like that without the intention of seriously harming or murdering someone. I tried to dig up more information on Joseph Clinton Mills, but found virtually nothing, which sometimes I find especially disturbing in a case like this. What could compel a 20-year-old man to crawl into the bedroom of the mother of a boy he coaches football and rape and murder her? All violent crimes are horrendous, but this act really bugged me. He chose a victim knowing he would orphan 2 sons in the process, and he knew one of those sons personally. He drove him to practice and he coached him. After the crime, Mills showed no evidence of a guilty conscience, of shame, even of fear for what he'd done. He continued to drive Tim to school. I can't help but wonder about what kind of deficiency must exist in a human being that could do this horrible thing at 20 years old and seemingly be unfazed by it. Not only to be unaffected by the agony of her sons losing their mother in this violent way, but even the pressure from the police and the fear of the investigation. You would think that a 20-year-old man would show some signs of unraveling in a situation like this. And Joseph Mills, as far as everything I could find, did not. Another odd thing is that there's no evidence of additional sexual assaults or murders. Was this a one-time thing? Could a human being do something so depraved at 20 and never do it again? I doubt it. If he'd cracked a bit all those years ago, acted out emotionally in some way to reveal that he actually felt something or was changed by committing this murder, I might think he never killed anyone again. But there's no evidence of that. No one even remotely connected him with this crime in 1981, even though he dropped Tim off at Linda's apartment pretty much the night she was murdered. That to me implies a very cool, detached, disconnected person. Even now, more than 35 years later, he has no interest in making amends for his crime. Clearly, he hasn't been racked by shame all these years. He isn't confessing now. He's simply continuing to make up new stories to explain away the evidence of what he did. So that pretty much sums up my thoughts on the case. I really don't have any satisfying conclusion to the conversation about Joseph Mills and why he did what he did, because we don't know, and he's not talking about it truthfully. I will say I found myself really intrigued by the genetic genealogy aspect of this case, and I will definitely cover some more cases that have been solved by genetic genealogy in the future. If you want to know more about the case of Linda Slaten, you can find a link in the show notes to my website, which is www.bitterendingspod.com. The post for this show will have a short description of the case as well as links to a whole bunch of articles about Slaten's murder, as well as articles about PARABON and genetic genealogy. Thanks again for sticking with me despite the delay in episodes. Have a great day. If you have any comments or case suggestions, please send me an email at bitterendingspodcast@gmail.com. You can also find out all of the resources for this episode and read the show notes and more. Visit my website at www.bitterendingspod.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Bitter Endings Podcast. The Bitter Endings Podcast is sponsored by My Fiction Novels. The Northern Michigan Asylum series are novels that braid elements of haunting and murder mystery, and they're all inspired by a real former asylum here in Traverse City, Michigan, which is where I live. You can find the novels on Amazon.com in audio format if you are an Audible listener, as well as in ebook and paperback. If you enjoyed today's episode of Bitter Endings and you would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to this podcast and also leaving a review. Thanks so much and have an amazing and a safe day. I just want to take a quick minute to also acknowledge the music played in the Bitter Endings podcast. This song is called Disease Tree by Noya Sakamata.